April 13, 1945. The rolling hills of Thuringia, Germany. Captain James Mitchell of the 761st Tank Battalion crouched in a muddy foxhole, watching the early morning mist cling to the valley below like a grey shroud. His Sherman tank, named Georgia Peach, sat idle 30 meters behind him, its engine cold. Mitchell and his crew had been holding this position for 18 hours, part of the American advance through central Germany during the final weeks of the conflict in Europe. The German forces were retreating, disorganized, desperate. Everyone believed the end was inevitable, just a matter of days or weeks. Victory seemed certain, resistance seemed futile. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them knew was that within the next 72 hours, one man's ingenuity would transform this quiet hillside into a graveyard for 40 armored vehicles using nothing but mud, determination, and an understanding of terrain that would leave military historians debating his methods for decades to come. The man who would orchestrate this impossible feat was not Captain Mitchell. It was not any of the tank commanders or artillery officers positioned along the American lines. It was Private First Class Elijah Carter, a 23-year-old combat engineer from Louisiana, whose specialty was building bridges and clearing obstacles. Carter stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighed 155 pounds, and possessed hands scarred from years of farm work before the military. He was also one of fewer than 1,200 African-American soldiers serving in integrated combat units during this final phase of the conflict, part of an experimental program that would not become permanent policy for another 3 years. Carter's path to that German hillside had been long and difficult. Born in 1922 in a small Louisiana community near the Mississippi border, he had grown up in circumstances that most Americans never witnessed. His father, Samuel Carter, worked land he did not own as a sharecropper, farming cotton and vegetables on property that belonged to a white landowner, who kept careful accounting of every seed, every tool, every transaction. The Carter family lived in a 4-room wooden house with gaps between the planks wide enough to see daylight, heated by a single wood stove that barely held off the winter cold. But Samuel Carter possessed something that could not be taken away: knowledge. He understood soil with an intimacy born of necessity. He could look at earth and tell you its composition, its drainage characteristics, its growing potential. He could predict floods 3 days before they arrived by reading subtle signs in the water flow and animal behavior. He had learned these skills from his own father, who had learned them during the final years of enslavement, when understanding the land meant survival. Elijah grew up following his father through the fields, learning to read the earth. Samuel would dig small holes and have young Elijah feel the soil at different depths, teaching him to recognize clay content by texture alone. They would study how rain moved across the land, where water pooled, which areas dried quickly, and which stayed saturated for days. Samuel taught his son that soil was not uniform. It had layers, personalities, moods that changed with weather and season. "Most folks see dirt as just dirt," Samuel would say, kneeling beside a furrow with soil in his weathered hands. "But dirt tells stories if you learn to listen. This here clay, it is stubborn, holds water like a miser holds coins. But that sandy loam over yonder, it lets water pass right through. You need to understand what you are working with before you can make it work for you." These lessons seemed ordinary at the time, just part of rural childhood. Elijah had no idea they would one day stop 40 tanks on a German hillside, but the knowledge sank deep, becoming instinctive. By the time Elijah was 15, he could walk across property he had never seen before and describe its drainage patterns, predict where erosion would occur, identify where crops would thrive and where they would struggle. The Carter family's life was hard, but not unusual for black sharecroppers in Louisiana during the 1930s and early 40s. They worked from dawn to dusk during growing season, lived on credit from the landowner's store, and somehow never quite earned enough to pay off their debt. It was a system designed to keep them perpetually obligated, perpetually poor. But Samuel insisted his children attend the small school for black children that operated 5 months a year, and he supplemented their education with his own teaching about the land. When the conflict in Europe expanded to include America in 1941, Elijah was 19 years old and working full-time on the farm. The military draft was in effect, but the American armed forces were still segregated, with black soldiers primarily assigned to support roles, loading ships, driving trucks, cooking, performing manual labor. Combat positions were generally reserved for white soldiers. The military leadership believed, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, that African American soldiers lacked the intelligence, courage, or discipline for frontline fighting. Elijah received his draft notice in March 1943. He reported to Camp Claiborne in Louisiana for basic training, where he was assigned to an engineering battalion. The training focused on construction, demolition, and obstacle removal, building bridges, clearing mines, repairing roads. It was grueling work, often performed under simulated combat conditions, but Elijah excelled. His understanding of terrain and soil gave him advantages his instructors noticed. Sergeant Frank Morrison, a white engineer from Michigan who supervised much of the training, took particular interest in Elijah's abilities. During a field exercise involving the construction of a temporary bridge across a creek, Elijah had correctly predicted that the south bank would not support the bridge's weight due to subsurface saturation, despite the bank appearing solid. When the bridge partially collapsed during testing, exactly as Elijah had warned, Morrison pulled him aside. "How did you know that bank would fail?" Morrison asked. "The soil composition, Sergeant. Clay sublayer about 8 inches down, holding water. Surface looked firm, but it was basically floating on saturated clay, not enough shear strength to handle distributed load." Morrison stared at him. "Where did you learn engineering terminology like that?" "Picked it up from the manuals, Sergeant, but I learned about soil from my father. He taught me to read ground the way most folks read newspapers." Morrison made a note in Elijah's file. "Exceptional aptitude for terrain analysis and soil mechanics. Recommend advanced training." That recommendation would eventually lead to Elijah being selected for the Experimental Integration Program in early 1945, when the American military, facing manpower shortages and pressure to desegregate, began assigning small numbers of African American soldiers to previously all-white combat units. Elijah arrived at the 761st Tank Battalion in late March 1945, one of only 8 black soldiers in a unit of over 600 men. The reception was mixed. Some white soldiers resented his presence, viewing it as social experimentation that endangered unit cohesion. Others were indifferent. A few, like Captain Mitchell, judged soldiers by their competence rather than their race. Elijah kept his head down, did his work efficiently, and tried not to provide ammunition to those who opposed integration. Carter had arrived at Mitchell's position 2 days earlier with a unique assignment. Intelligence had reported that a German armored column was retreating eastward, possibly heading toward a last-stand defensive position. The column consisted of approximately 40 to 50 tanks and armored vehicles, including some of the heavier models that had proven difficult to stop with standard anti-tank weapons. Carter's orders were simple: assess the terrain and recommend defensive positions. What he discovered would change everything. The hill that Mitchell's battalion occupied was designated Hill 227 on American maps, a modest elevation rising 140 meters above the surrounding farmland. Its eastern slope, the direction from which German forces would approach, descended at a gentle 15-degree angle for roughly 800 meters before leveling into a natural basin. This basin, approximately 200 meters wide and 400 meters long, appeared unremarkable to most observers. But Carter saw something different. He saw the perfect trap. Carter spent hours examining the basin on April 11th, using techniques his father had taught him decades earlier. He dug test holes at various locations, going down 18 to 24 inches. Examining the soil composition at different depths, he found what he had suspected: a deceptive formation where a relatively firm surface layer of sandy loam, approximately 4 to 6 inches thick, overlay a much thicker layer of saturated clay. The clay layer was extraordinary, at least 3 feet thick in most locations, with a moisture content that Carter estimated at over 40%. This was far above the point where clay loses its structural integrity. It meant the subsurface was essentially a thick, viscous fluid trapped beneath a thin crust of drier soil. Natural springs feeding into the basin from underground sources kept this clay layer perpetually saturated even during dry weather. Carter also noticed that the basin's shape created a natural funnel. The only practical vehicle routes led into the basin from the east, where the German column would approach. Exits were limited. Steep embankments on both north and south sides made lateral escape difficult, and the only forward route led up the exposed slope of Hill 227, directly into American defensive positions. Any vehicles entering the basin would have limited options if they encountered problems. Most significantly, Carter recognized that the basin had been used as farmland before the conflict. Deep plow furrows, created by agricultural equipment and still visible despite several years of neglect, ran perpendicular to the likely German approach route. These furrows had disrupted the soil's natural stratification, creating lines of weakness that could be exploited. Carter filled a notebook with observations, sketches, and calculations. He measured distances, estimated vehicle weights, calculated the load-bearing capacity of saturated clay, and designed modifications that would transform the basin from marginally passable terrain into an inescapable trap. Then, on the afternoon of April 11th, he requested a meeting with Captain Mitchell. Mitchell was in his command post, a reinforced cellar beneath a partially destroyed farmhouse, studying maps with his executive officer, Lieutenant Hayes, when Carter arrived. Mitchell looked up from his maps, slightly annoyed at the interruption. "Yes, Private?" Carter stood at attention. "Sir, I have completed my terrain assessment. I believe I can stop the German column without direct engagement." Mitchell's annoyance transformed into curiosity. "Explain." "The eastern basin, sir. It appears solid, but the subsurface is saturated clay with minimal load-bearing capacity. With modifications, we can create conditions where heavy vehicles will become immobilized. They will sink and be unable to maneuver or retreat." Hayes, the executive officer, spoke up. "Private, we walked that ground yesterday. It is firm. Our own vehicles crossed it without difficulty. Your vehicles were on the northern edge, sir, where the soil composition is different, and they were lighter vehicles, jeeps and trucks. Heavy tanks will behave differently. The weight concentration under tank tracks will break through the surface crust and sink into the saturated clay below." Mitchell leaned back in his chair. "You are proposing we deliberately weaken the ground." "Not weaken, sir. Transform. The ground is already weak below the surface. I want to remove the surface's ability to support weight and make the subsurface conditions obvious to us but invisible to them. Create a trap that looks like normal terrain." "How would you do this?" Carter laid out his plan in detail. He wanted to use the battalion's engineering equipment, 2 bulldozers, 1 excavator, and portable water pumps, to systematically modify the basin. The process would involve 3 phases: cutting shallow trenches to disrupt surface integrity, pumping additional water into the subsurface to further saturate the clay, and carefully camouflaging all modifications to make the trap invisible. The trenches would be cut in a grid pattern, intersecting the natural plow furrows to create a network of weaknesses. Each trench would be only 8 to 12 inches deep, but strategically placed to ensure that tank tracks would cross multiple trench lines within the first 30 meters of entering the basin. The trenches would be filled with loose topsoil and vegetation, disguising their existence while providing no structural support. The water saturation phase was critical. Carter wanted to use pumps to move water from nearby streams into the trench network, allowing it to percolate into the clay layer and increase moisture content even further. Clay's strength decreases exponentially as moisture content increases. At 40% moisture, clay might support limited weight, but at 50 or 60%, it becomes essentially liquid. The camouflage phase required attention to every detail. The modified area had to look identical to surrounding terrain. Disturbed soil had to be covered with grass and debris. Trench locations had to follow natural contours. Nothing could appear artificial or suspicious. Mitchell listened to the entire presentation, asking occasional questions about timing, resources, and probability of success. When Carter finished, Mitchell sat silent for nearly a minute, considering the proposal. Hayes, the executive officer, was skeptical. "Captain, this is highly unconventional. We have anti-tank guns, artillery, air support on call. Why risk an unproven technique?" Mitchell turned to Carter. "Private, be honest with me. What is the probability this works as you describe?" Carter met his eyes without hesitation. "Sir, if they enter the basin with heavy vehicles, I estimate 90% probability of multiple immobilizations within the first minute. Maybe higher. The physics are clear. Saturated clay cannot support tank weight, and we will be creating ideal conditions for failure. And if you are wrong, if they roll across and reach our positions, then we fight them conventionally, sir. But I am not wrong about the soil. I have been reading ground like this since I was 6 years old. This will work." Mitchell made a decision that demonstrated either remarkable trust or desperate pragmatism. "You have 24 hours, Private. If intelligence is right, the German column will be here in 2 days. Take whatever equipment and men you need. Lieutenant Hayes will provide support. Do not let me down." Carter saluted sharply. "Thank you, sir. I will not." Within an hour, Carter had assembled his crew. Getting volunteers proved surprisingly straightforward. Soldiers generally preferred construction work to waiting tensely for combat. Hayes assigned 8 men from the Combat Engineer Company, Corporal Danny Wilson from Texas, Privates First Class Robert Jensen from Wisconsin, and Anthony Russo from New York, and 5 other enlisted men whose skills ranged from equipment operation to general labor. Carter also requested the 3 other African-American soldiers in the battalion, Private Marcus Williams, a driver from Georgia, Private Leon Jackson, a mechanic from Alabama, and Private First Class Thomas Green, a demolition specialist from Mississippi. Having more black soldiers on the work detail was both practical. Carter wanted people he knew he could rely on, and political. If the plan succeeded, he wanted credit shared among multiple African-American soldiers, making it harder to dismiss as a lucky accident. The 12-man crew assembled at 1800 hours on April 11th in the fading daylight. Carter briefed them beside one of the bulldozers, using a stick to draw diagrams in the dirt. "Gentlemen, we are going to build the biggest mud trap ever constructed. The Germans are coming with 40 tanks, and we are going to make sure they never reach this hill. Some of you might think this is crazy. Maybe it is. But I know soil, I know mud, and I know this will work. Now let us get started." The work began immediately and continued without significant interruption for the next 31 hours. Carter divided his crew into 3 teams, each with specific responsibilities. Team 1, led by Corporal Wilson and operating the 2 bulldozers, handled the heavy earth moving. Their job was to cut trenches according to Carter's specifications, shallow channels running perpendicular to the expected German approach route, spaced at intervals calculated to ensure maximum disruption of surface integrity. Wilson, a farmer's son from West Texas, understood earth-moving equipment intimately and worked with precision despite the darkness. The bulldozer work was delicate. Cut too deep and the trenches would be obvious even after camouflage. Cut too shallow and they would provide insufficient disruption of the surface layer. Carter personally marked each trench location with stakes and string, then supervised as Wilson's team made the cuts. Each trench was exactly 10 inches deep, 14 inches wide, and extended across the full width of the anticipated German approach corridor. Team 2, supervised by Private Jackson, managed the water pumps. Carter had identified 3 small streams within 500 meters of the basin, all fed by the same underground springs that kept the subsurface saturated. Using portable pumps powered by gasoline engines and canvas hoses that had been designed for firefighting, Jackson's team channeled water into the trench network. The pumping operation required constant attention. Hoses kinked or burst, pumps overheated or clogged with debris. Jackson proved invaluable using his mechanical skills to keep equipment functioning. By midnight of the first night, they had pumped approximately 15,000 gallons of water into the trenches, watching it slowly percolate into the clay layer below. Team 3, which Carter led personally with help from Green and Williams, handled the critical camouflage work. Every trench had to be covered after the water saturated the subsurface. The covering material needed to be substantial enough to look natural, but light enough not to provide structural support. Carter decided on a mixture of loose topsoil, grass, and debris. material that would support a man walking but compress instantly under vehicle weight. The camouflage work was painstaking. Carter examined each covered trench personally, walking across it, testing its appearance from different angles and lighting conditions. If they suspect a trap, they will find another route, he repeated constantly. This has to look completely natural. No straight lines, no artificial patterns, no disturbed earth that stands out. By midnight of the first night, the crew had modified approximately 30% of the basin. The men worked in rotation, 6 hours on, 2 hours off, but Carter barely slept. He moved constantly between work sites, adjusting plans, solving problems, driving the operation forward through sheer determination. Private Williams, watching Carter inspect a section of camouflaged trench at 0200 hours, said quietly to Jackson, "Man works like he is possessed. Does not stop. Does not slow down." Jackson, tightening a connection on one of the pumps, replied, "He knows what is riding on this. We all do. Those tanks get through, a lot of our guys die. This works, maybe nobody dies. That is worth losing some sleep over." The work attracted attention. Soldiers from other units seeing the activity came to investigate. Some offered help. Others made jokes about the crazy engineer building mud pies. But none interfered, and Mitchell ensured Carter had priority for equipment and resources. At 0300 hours, Lieutenant Hayes visited the site. He found Carter in one of the trenches, using his bare hands to shape the mud consistency, testing its viscosity and behavior. Hayes stood at the trench edge, watching. "Private Carter, you look like a child playing in mud puddles." Carter looked up, his face and hands caked with dirt. "In a way, sir, that is exactly what I am doing, but there is science to it. This clay needs to be just the right consistency, too thin, and it drains away or dries too quickly. Too thick and it retains some structural integrity that might support weight. I am looking for that perfect middle ground, where it is liquid enough to flow but thick enough to trap." Hayes crouched beside the trench. "How do you know when you have found that perfect consistency?" Carter scooped up a handful of mud and let it flow through his fingers. "You feel it, sir. This here is close but not quite right. Needs maybe another hour of saturation time. When it is ready, it will flow like honey but grip like glue. That is what we need." Hayes watched the operation for another 20 minutes, then returned to Mitchell's command post. "Sir, I think Carter might actually pull this off. He understands that soil better than most engineers understand concrete. It is remarkable to watch." Mitchell, who had been dozing fitfully in his command chair, opened his eyes. "Lieutenant, I have learned something in this military. Expertise comes in unexpected packages. Carter might be a private from Louisiana with no formal engineering degree, but he has knowledge that none of us possess. Sometimes the smart thing is to recognize that and get out of the way." By dawn on April 12th, the trap was 50% complete. The day was warmer, accelerating the water absorption and saturation process. Carter made a critical strategic decision to extend the trap zone by an additional 100 meters to the north, reducing the available bypass routes around the basin. This meant significantly more work, but Carter calculated it was necessary. "We need to give them no choice but to enter the kill zone," he explained to his exhausted crew during a brief break. "If there is an easy way around, they will take it. We are not just building a trap. We are building a funnel that makes the trap appear to be the best route. The more alternatives we eliminate, the more likely they commit their column to terrain we control." The extension meant the crew had to work another full day. Several men were approaching complete exhaustion, but Carter's determination proved infectious. Corporal Wilson, his hands blistered from operating the bulldozer for over 20 hours, summed up the crew's attitude. "We have come this far. Might as well finish the job right." By 1800 hours on April 12th, with only 24 hours remaining before the expected German arrival, the physical modifications were approximately 85% complete. Carter made the decision to focus the final 12 hours on perfecting the camouflage rather than expanding the modified zone further. "What we have is enough if it looks natural," he told his team. "Let us make it perfect." The final 12 hours involved hundreds of small adjustments. Grass was transplanted onto covered trenches. Small bushes were moved to disguise soil disturbance. Debris was scattered to match the surrounding terrain. Carter walked the entire modified zone multiple times, viewing it from every angle, ensuring nothing appeared artificial. At 0600 on April 13th, Carter made his final inspection. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the basin. The modified zone looked like any other piece of abandoned farmland, slightly overgrown, marked by old plough furrows, showing signs of neglect. Only someone who knew exactly what to look for would notice the subtle variations in soil color, the slightly depressed areas where trenches had been filled, the pattern of moisture that indicated subsurface saturation. Carter stood at the basin's eastern edge, where German vehicles would enter, and slowly walked the likely approach route. His boots barely sank into the surface, the crust held his weight easily. But 30 meters ahead, where the first major trench line crossed the route, he picked up a 20-kilogram stone and dropped it from shoulder height. The stone punched through the surface crust and disappeared into the mud below with a wet, sucking sound. When Carter reached down to retrieve it, his arm sank to the elbow before finding the stone. The mud underneath had the consistency of thick porridge. Carter smiled grimly. The trap was ready. Mitchell inspected the site personally at 0700. He walked the basin cautiously, testing the surface, examining the camouflage. "It looks completely normal, Private. If I did not know better, I would drive vehicles across this without hesitation." "That is the intention, sir." Carter demonstrated with the same stone, showing how the surface collapsed under concentrated weight. Light vehicles and infantry can cross without problems. Their weight is distributed enough, or they step between the trap points. But anything heavier than 3 tons will break through within seconds. Mitchell nodded slowly. "Private Carter, if this works the way you describe, you will have accomplished something extraordinary. If it does not—" "It will work, sir," Carter interrupted quietly. "I stake my life on it." The German column was first spotted at 1400 hours by American reconnaissance aircraft. The forward air observer radioed, "Large armored formation approaching from the east. Count approximately 40 to 45 vehicles. Mixed types including medium tanks and self-propelled artillery. Speed approximately 10 kilometers per hour. Estimated arrival your position 1800 to 1900 hours." Mitchell assembled his officers and senior non-commissioned officers for final briefing at 1500 hours. In addition to explaining the tactical plan, he made a point of crediting Carter publicly. "Gentlemen, Private Carter has spent the last 2 days preparing a surprise for our guests. The Eastern Basin has been modified to trap heavy vehicles. When the German column enters that zone, their vehicles will become immobilized. Our job is to prevent their escape or bypass. Anti-tank guns will cover potential bypass routes on the flanks. Artillery will target any vehicles that attempt to reverse out of the trap. Machine guns will suppress infantry. No one fires until the majority of their column is committed to the basin." "Understood." The officers acknowledged their orders, though several exchanged skeptical glances. Sergeant Pete Morrison, a tank commander from Nebraska, spoke up. "Captain, with respect, the ground down there looks solid. How can we be sure it will trap them?" Mitchell gestured to Carter, who was standing at the back of the room. "Private, demonstrate for the sergeant." Carter had anticipated this question. He had brought a glass jar filled with the basin's saturated clay. "Sergeant, this is the subsurface material under that basin. Watch." He placed a small metal model of a tank on top of the clay in the jar. For a few seconds, it sat on the surface. Then it slowly tilted and sank, disappearing completely within 30 seconds. "That is what will happen to their tanks. The surface looks solid, but underneath it cannot support weight. Once they break through the crust, the clay grips them, and they cannot maneuver." Morrison looked at the jar, then at Carter, then back at Mitchell. "Well, I will be. That is clever." Mitchell dismissed the briefing. "Everyone to your positions. This could be the last significant engagement of the conflict in this sector. Let us make it count, and let us try to do it with minimum casualties on both sides. These German soldiers are probably just as eager for this to end as we are." Carter positioned himself with Mitchell's command group on Hill 227's crest. From this vantage point, they had a clear view of the entire basin and the approaches from the east. Carter carried his binoculars, his notebook, and an almost physical tension that made him vibrate like a taut wire. Mitchell noticed. "Nervous, Private?" "Yes, sir. Respectfully, I have never done anything like this before. I believe in the science, but there is always that small doubt. What if I missed something? What if the soil composition varied more than I realized? What if they see through the camouflage? Then we fight them conventionally and you tried something innovative that did not work. There is no shame in that. But I do not think you missed anything. I watched you work for 2 days. I have never seen anyone more thorough." At 1600 hours, the German column came into direct visual range, emerging from a tree line approximately 2 kilometers east of the basin. Through his binoculars, Carter could see them clearly, a long line of armored vehicles moving in a defensive formation, with scout elements ranging ahead, checking for threats and obstacles. Carter counted vehicles methodically. 27 medium tanks of various models, 8 self-propelled artillery pieces, 4 armored personnel carriers, and several lighter vehicles. 42 vehicles total, matching the intelligence estimates. The column moved cautiously, stopping frequently, while scouts checked the route ahead. At 16:15, the German scouts reached the basin. 2 motorcycles with sidecars entered the modified zone, their lightweight distributed across multiple wheels, allowing them to cross without breaking through the crust. They traversed the entire basin, exited on the western side, and rode up the lower slope of Hill 227 before American machine gun fire, deliberately aimed high, forced them to retreat. The scouts returned to the column and reported to their commander. Carter watched this development with satisfaction. "The scouts crossed safely, so they will report the route is clear. That is exactly what we needed." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "You planned for that?" "Yes, sir. Light vehicles will not trigger the trap. But when they report safe passage, the column commander will be less suspicious when his heavy vehicles enter." At 16:45, the German column began its approach to the basin. The formation tightened as vehicles moved from open farmland into the narrower space between the basin and surrounding hills. Carter noted with approval that they were following the exact route he had anticipated, entering the basin from its eastern side and moving toward the western edge and Hill 227 beyond. At 16:52, the lead vehicle, a medium tank weighing approximately 23 tons, entered the modified zone. Carter watched through his binoculars, his hands steady, despite the tension coiling in his chest. The tank advanced at perhaps 8 kilometers per hour, its tracks churning steadily. 20 meters, 30 meters, 40 meters, then it happened. The tank's front right track punched through the surface crust. Carter saw the moment clearly. The surface collapsed beneath the track. The tank lurched rightward. The driver attempted to correct, but the corrective maneuver only caused the left track to break through as well. Within 15 seconds, the tank had sunk to its hull, both tracks churning uselessly in the saturated clay beneath the surface. The more the driver tried to power through, the deeper the tank settled. The tank commander opened his hatch and looked around, clearly confused about what had just happened. His vehicle had gone from normal movement to complete immobilization in seconds. He radioed back to the column, presumably reporting a problem. The second tank tried to swing wide around the first, apparently attempting to bypass the trouble spot. This proved impossible. The tank advanced perhaps 20 meters before experiencing the same sudden loss of traction. Its tracks broke through the crust. It lurched sideways, and within seconds it too was stuck, settling deeper with every attempted movement. Third tank, fourth tank, fifth tank. Like dominoes falling in slow motion, vehicle after vehicle entered the basin and became trapped. Some tried to reverse immediately upon seeing the earlier vehicles stuck, but the reversal attempt only caused their tracks to churn through the crust faster. The physics were implacable. Saturated clay provides almost zero traction, and once tank tracks broke through the surface, there was no solid ground to push against. By 1700 hours, just 8 minutes after the first tank entered, 17 German vehicles were completely immobilized in the basin, their tracks spinning futilely, their hulls settling deeper into the mud with every passing minute. The sight was surreal, millions of marks worth of military equipment, representing hundreds of thousands of hours of factory work, rendered completely helpless by modified soil. The German column commander, watching this disaster unfold, made several desperate attempts to salvage the situation. He ordered his lighter vehicles to remain on higher ground while trying to maneuver his remaining mobile tanks around the basin's flanks. This was the moment Mitchell had anticipated. "Anti-tank guns," Mitchell said calmly into his radio. "Engage flanking vehicles." The American anti-tank guns had perfect fields of fire on both potential bypass routes. The guns, positioned on Hill 227 slopes with clear sightlines, opened fire. The first 2 rounds missed. Range estimation in the late afternoon light was difficult. The third round struck a German tank attempting to bypass the basin to the north, penetrating its thinner side armor and causing immediate catastrophic damage. The tank stopped, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Its crew evacuated successfully, running for cover in a nearby tree line. 2 more German tanks attempting a southern bypass route were similarly engaged. One was hit and disabled. The other, seeing what happened to its companion, retreated hastily to more protected terrain. The bypass routes were effectively blocked. By 1730, the engagement had reached a stalemate. 38 German vehicles were trapped in the basin, unable to move forward, backward, or laterally. The crews remained with their vehicles, hoping for rescue or new orders. 4 additional German vehicles had been disabled while attempting to bypass the trap. The remaining vehicles from the column had withdrawn to covered positions approximately 1 kilometer east, unwilling to risk further losses. What followed was a strange period of relative quiet. German crews, realizing their situation was hopeless, mostly remained in their vehicles, but ceased attempting to maneuver. Some crew members opened hatches to get fresh air, sitting on their immobilized tanks, like farmers resting on tractors. A few attempted to use their tanks' main guns to fire on American positions, but stuck in mud and unable to properly traverse turrets or adjust elevation, they posed minimal threat. American soldiers, watching this unprecedented scene, reacted with mixtures of amazement, amusement, and professional satisfaction. Corporal Wilson, who had operated one of the bulldozers during the trap's construction, summed up the general feeling. "I have been in this military for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like this. 40 tanks stuck in the mud like flies on flypaper. Carter is a genius." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the basin full of stranded vehicles, Captain Mitchell made a decision. Rather than ordering his artillery to destroy the trapped vehicles, which would have caused significant casualties among crews who were no longer combatants, he decided to offer terms. "Get me a loudspeaker," he told his communications sergeant, "and find someone who speaks German." Private Carl Schmidt, a German-American from Wisconsin who spoke fluent German, was brought forward. Mitchell dictated a message. "To the German commander and crews, you are surrounded and your vehicles are immobilized. Further resistance is pointless. If you surrender, you will be treated according to the laws of war. You have 30 minutes to decide. If you choose to fight, we will have no choice but to destroy your vehicles with you inside them. Choose wisely." Schmidt translated and repeated the message 3 times through the loudspeaker. The sound echoed across the basin. Then everyone waited. 17 minutes later, a white flag appeared on one of the trapped tanks. Then another. Then a dozen. Within 25 minutes, all the trapped vehicles were displaying surrender flags, white undershirts, torn pieces of cloth, anything pale that could be waved. The German crews began evacuating their vehicles, hands raised, moving in groups toward the American positions. Mitchell detailed soldiers to process the prisoners. The operation took over 2 hours as nearly 200 German soldiers, tank crew, artillery crews, vehicle commanders, made their way out of the basin and up the hill to American lines. They were searched for weapons, documented, given water, and moved to a temporary holding area. Most seemed relieved that the conflict, for them at least, was over. Among the German prisoners was the column commander, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, a 34-year-old veteran who had commanded armored vehicles since 1941. Weber spoke reasonable English, learned during 2 years studying engineering at a British university before the conflict. During his initial processing, he encountered Carter, who was assisting with the prisoner documentation. Weber looked at Carter with an expression mixing frustration, curiosity, and grudging respect. You are the engineer who built this trap? Weber asked, gesturing toward the basin full of stranded vehicles. Yes, Carter replied, continuing to fill out documentation forms. Weber shook his head slowly. We had no warning, no indication. The ground appeared completely normal to our scouts. Our lead vehicles reported solid surface conditions. Then, within seconds, we were sinking. I have commanded tanks through mud, through snow, through sand. I thought I understood terrain challenges. But this was something entirely different. How did you do it? Carter looked up from his paperwork. The ground was already saturated below the surface, natural clay layer holding water from underground springs. I just modified the surface integrity and added more water to increase the subsurface moisture content. Physics did the rest. Weber considered this. You understand, this is very humiliating for us. To be defeated not by superior tanks or better tactics, but by modified soil. Our crews trained for years. Our vehicles cost fortunes to produce. And we are stopped by mud engineered by... He paused, then continued carefully. By a combat engineer who recognized terrain vulnerabilities we completely missed. Carter met his eyes. With respect, sir, you were not defeated by mud. You were defeated by someone understanding terrain better than you did. The mud was just the tool, and for what it is worth, I'm glad this ended with minimal casualties on both sides. Lot of men going home to their families tonight who might not have otherwise. Weber nodded slowly. A philosophical distinction, but perhaps you are right. Tell me, did you study engineering at a university? No, sir. I learned from my father, who was a farmer. Weber's expression shifted to something approaching wonder. A farmer's son defeated an experienced armored column using principles learned on a farm. This conflict has taught us many lessons. Perhaps the most important is that expertise and capability come from unexpected places, and that underestimating others based on their background is a recipe for failure. This conversation, recorded in Mitchell's personal diary, exemplified one of the engagement's broader lessons. The conflict had been fought largely with industrial might, technological advancement, and organizational efficiency. Both sides had invested enormous resources in producing better tanks, better weapons, better equipment. But at Hill 227, all that investment was neutralized by one man who understood soil mechanics through lived experience rather than formal education. The evening of April 13th passed into night. The trapped German vehicles remained in the basin. Recovering them would require engineering equipment and effort that nobody wanted to invest with the conflict approaching its end. American guards watched over the prisoner-holding area. Mitchell's battalion maintained defensive positions, though the threat had effectively been eliminated. Carter stood on Hill 227's crest at 2200 hours, looking down at the basin full of stranded vehicles. The scene was surreal in the darkness, dozens of tank hulls protruding from the ground like strange monuments. Silent now, their engines cold. Mitchell joined him. "Private Carter," Mitchell said, "I have been in this military for 9 years. I studied armored tactics at West Point. I have commanded tanks through France and into Germany. And in all that time, I never imagined something like this. You stopped an entire armored column without firing a shot from a tank, without calling in air support, without using mines or obstacles. You did it with mud and understanding." Carter was quiet for a moment. "Sir, where I come from, we learn early that nature is more powerful than anything humans can build. You cannot fight nature. You can only understand it and work with it. Those tanks down there represent the finest engineering that modern industry can produce. But none of that matters when the ground beneath you will not hold. How did you know it would work so completely? You must have had doubts." "I had doubts, yes, sir. There is always uncertainty. I spent last night lying awake thinking about what would happen if I was wrong, if the tanks just rolled across and reached our positions. A lot of good men would have been in danger because I convinced you to trust me. That responsibility was heavy." Mitchell turned to look at him. "But you were not wrong." "No, sir. This time I was not. But I will admit, when that first tank entered the basin and started across, I was holding my breath. When it sank, I felt relief and satisfaction in equal measure. The science was sound, but seeing it actually work was different from calculating it on paper. What you accomplished here today will be studied and discussed. I'm going to make sure your role is properly documented and credited. You deserve recognition for this innovation." Carter smiled slightly, though without much humor. "Recognition would be nice, sir, but I am a black soldier in 1945. I have realistic expectations about how this will be received. Some people will credit the success to you, or to the engineering company, or to good luck. They will find ways to minimize what I did, because acknowledging it would challenge their assumptions about who can possess expertise and intelligence." Mitchell frowned. "That would be unjust." "Yes, sir, it would be. But injustice is something I am familiar with. My father is one of the smartest men I have ever known, and he spent his whole life working land he could never own, forever in debt to a system designed to keep him that way. Smart does not always get you recognized, especially if you are the wrong color. But you know what I'm proud of? Those 40 tanks sitting in that mud. That is my recognition. Every German crew member who walked away alive tonight, every American soldier who did not have to fight today, that is worth more than any medal." The two men stood in silence for several minutes, watching the darkened basin. Finally, Mitchell spoke again. "For what it is worth, Private, you have my profound respect, and I will ensure that anyone who reads the official record knows exactly who accomplished this and how it was done. Thank you, sir. That means something." The next morning, April 14th, brought a surreal scene. The trapped German vehicles remained in the basin, their crews now prisoners. The morning light revealed the extent of the trap. Vehicles at various angles, some tilted dramatically, where one side had sunk deeper than the other, all immobilized as if they had been carefully placed in an outdoor museum display. A team from Divisional Intelligence arrived at 0900 to document the engagement and interview participants. Captain Edward Foster from Ohio led the team. He spent the first hour simply walking the basin, examining the trapped vehicles, studying the soil conditions, trying to understand what had happened. Foster then interviewed Carter for over 2 hours, taking extensive notes and asking detailed questions about his methods. "Private Carter, this is extraordinary, and it is not standard military doctrine by any measure. Where did you learn these techniques?" "From my father, sir. He was a sharecropper in Louisiana. We did not have money for machines or fancy equipment, so we learned to understand the land itself, how water moves through different soils, how weight distributes across soft ground, how clay behaves when saturated, how to build earthen structures that held against floodwaters. I just applied those same principles to a military problem." Foster wrote quickly, "This should be taught at engineer school. The Army should be studying and incorporating these methods into doctrine." Carter smiled, but said nothing. He understood that the likelihood of the Army adopting tactics developed by a black private from Louisiana was minimal, regardless of their effectiveness. Foster continued, "The efficiency of this engagement is remarkable. By my count, 38 vehicles immobilized in the trap, 4 more disabled while attempting bypass, nearly 200 prisoners taken, and American casualties are 0. 0. When is the last time an entire armored column was stopped with 0 friendly casualties? I could not tell you, sir, but I will say that avoiding bloodshed was intentional. The whole point of the trap was to immobilize vehicles, not destroy them. Once they were stuck, there was no need for violence. They could not threaten us, could not escape, could not do anything except surrender or wait. That gave us the luxury of offering terms rather than fighting." "Do you think this technique could be replicated elsewhere?" Carter considered the question carefully. "Yes and no, sir. The specific technique requires specific conditions, the right soil type, natural saturation, appropriate terrain configuration. You could not do this just anywhere. But the broader principle, understanding terrain deeply and modifying it to create tactical advantages, that applies universally. Most armies study how to fight on terrain. Fewer armies study how to change the terrain itself to make fighting unnecessary or advantageous." Foster made more notes. "I am going to recommend that your methods be compiled into a technical manual. Would you be willing to help with that?" "If ordered, sir, of course. But I will tell you honestly, the best way to learn this is not from a manual. It is from years of working with soil, experiencing how it behaves in different conditions, developing an intuitive feel for moisture content and load-bearing capacity. That comes from experience, not reading. The engagement at Hill 227 attracted attention beyond divisional intelligence. Within a week, officers from Corps and Army level had visited to examine the site and review the documentation. The story circulated through military channels, often in simplified or garbled forms. Some versions credited Captain Mitchell with the innovation, others attributed it to the entire engineering company. Carter's name appeared in official reports, but did not feature prominently in the informal retellings. This pattern of diminished credit was predictable, but still disappointing. Mitchell attempted to correct the record whenever he encountered misattributions, but the military culture of 1945 was not receptive to acknowledging that a 23-year-old black private had accomplished something that educated white officers had not conceived. 3 days after the engagement, on April 16th, the conflict in Europe moved into its final days. The German regime was collapsing rapidly. Within weeks, the conflict would officially end. Carter was transferred to reconstruction duties in Bavaria, where he spent the next 4 months helping rebuild bridges and infrastructure damaged during the fighting. His engineering skills were valuable. His innovation at Hill 227 largely forgotten except by those who had witnessed it directly. Carter received a promotion to corporal in May 1945, based partly on Mitchell's recommendations. He received no medals or formal recognition for his achievement at Hill 227. When he was discharged in November 1945 and returned to Louisiana, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing what he had accomplished, even if the broader world did not acknowledge it. Back in Louisiana, Carter found that little had changed. Segregation remained firmly in place. Economic opportunities for African Americans were limited. The skills and leadership he had demonstrated in the military meant little in civilian society. He worked various jobs: construction, road building, eventually starting a small contracting business that specialized in drainage and soil work. Carter married in 1948, started a family, and built a modest life. He rarely spoke about his military service, partly because people seemed uninterested, partly because the memories were mixed, pride in what he had accomplished combined with frustration at how it had been received. It was not until the 1970s that historians began conducting more comprehensive research on African American contributions to the conflict. Patricia Williams, a doctoral student studying integrated combat units, discovered Mitchell's after-action report in military archives. The report's description of the Hill 227 engagement caught her attention, particularly because it specifically credited Carter by name with the tactical innovation. Williams tracked down Carter, who was then living in New Orleans and working as a construction supervisor. She interviewed him extensively over several weeks in 1976. Their conversations, recorded and preserved at the Library of Congress, provide the most detailed account of the engagement from Carter's perspective. During those interviews, Carter was remarkably thoughtful about his experience. He acknowledged pride in his achievement, but also maintained perspective about its significance. When Williams asked about the lack of recognition, his response revealed both wisdom and grace. Recognition would have been nice, sure, but you know what I was proud of? Those 40 tanks sitting in that mud. That was my recognition. Every German crew member who walked away alive, every American soldier who did not have to fight that day, that was worth more than any medal. I knew what I had done. The men I served with knew. Captain Mitchell knew. That was enough. Williams pressed him. But does not it bother you that military histories rarely mention your name, that other people took credit for your innovation? Carter's response: Of course it bothered me at the time. I was 23, I had done something extraordinary, and I wanted acknowledgement. But over the years I have come to see it differently. What I did was prove something. To myself, to the men I served with, to anyone willing to see it. I proved that intelligence and capability do not have a color, that expertise can come from unexpected places, that someone dismissed by society as inferior could accomplish something that educated officers had not conceived. That proof exists, regardless of whether everyone acknowledges it. So you have no bitterness? Carter paused before answering. I would not say no bitterness, that would not be honest. Sure, there is bitterness about how I was treated, about the system that tried to limit me, But there is also satisfaction that despite that system I succeeded. I used knowledge passed down from my father, who was a sharecropper, to stop an armored column. That is a powerful statement about human potential and about the value of all people, regardless of their circumstances. Maybe that is a better legacy than a medal would have been. Williams's dissertation, completed in 1978, helped bring broader attention to Carter's achievement. Her work was cited in several subsequent histories of African American military service. By the 1980s, Carter's name began appearing in more comprehensive accounts of the conflict, though often as a footnote or brief mention rather than a central figure. The engagement at Hill 227 also became a case study in military education, particularly among combat engineers. The technique Carter employed, systematic terrain modification to create tactical advantages, was studied and refined. Modern military forces use sophisticated computer modeling and soil analysis to accomplish similar objectives. But the fundamental principle remains what Carter demonstrated: understanding terrain deeply enough to make it work for you rather than against you. Captain Mitchell, who retired from the military as a full colonel in 1963, maintained correspondence with Carter for nearly 40 years. Their letters, donated to the National Archives after Mitchell's death in 2001, reveal a friendship built on mutual respect. Mitchell's final letter to Carter, written just weeks before Mitchell's passing, included this paragraph: "Elijah, I have commanded good soldiers throughout my career, but I never met anyone who changed how I thought about leadership and capability the way you did on that hillside in Germany. You taught me that genius appears in unexpected places, and that the job of a good officer is to recognize it and enable it. You also taught me that formal education is just one path to expertise, and sometimes not the most important path. Thank you for that lesson, and for your friendship over all these years." Carter lived until 2006, passing away at age 84 in New Orleans. In his later years, he occasionally spoke at schools and community centers about his experiences, always emphasizing the importance of education and understanding. He never expressed bitterness about the delayed recognition, though he acknowledged that earlier acknowledgement would have been meaningful. A small museum in Germany, near the site of Hill 227, maintains an exhibit about the engagement. The exhibit includes photographs of the trapped vehicles, copies of military reports, and biographical information about both Mitchell and Carter. The museum's curator noted that the exhibit attracts particular interest from military personnel who study it as an example of innovative thinking. In 2003, 3 years before his death, Carter gave a final interview to a journalist from the Louisiana newspaper. The journalist asked what he wanted people to remember about Hill 227. Carter's response encapsulated both his achievement and his character. "I want people to understand that what happened at that hillside was not magic or luck. It was knowledge applied to a problem, knowledge passed down from my father, who learned it from his father, who learned it during enslavement. That knowledge survived, was valued, was transmitted across generations, and when the moment came, it proved decisive. That says something important about the value of all knowledge, all experience, all people. We should not dismiss anyone's potential based on their background or circumstances. Everyone has something valuable to contribute if we are willing to recognize it." The engagement at Hill 227 demonstrated several lessons that extended beyond its immediate tactical significance. First, it showed that military effectiveness often depends on cognitive diversity, having people with different backgrounds and expertise who can see solutions others miss. Carter's rural Louisiana upbringing gave him insights that no amount of conventional engineering training had provided his peers. Second, it illustrated how conflicts are often won as much by logistics, terrain understanding, and creative problem-solving as by firepower and courage. The German column that Carter stopped represented significant industrial investment and military training. All of it became irrelevant when confronted with modified soil conditions. Third, the engagement highlighted the importance of institutional flexibility. Military organizations function through hierarchy and standardization, but they also need space for unconventional thinking. Mitchell's willingness to authorize Carter's plan, despite its departure from doctrine, created the conditions for success. Fourth, it provided evidence that integration, allowing soldiers of different backgrounds to serve in combat roles, produced tangible military advantages. Carter was in that unit only because of experimental integration policies implemented near the conflict's end. Without those policies, his expertise would never have been available. The engagement also had psychological dimensions worth considering. For the German crews trapped in that basin, the experience must have been profoundly demoralizing. They had expected a conventional engagement, tank against tank, gun against gun, training and equipment determining the outcome. Instead, they found themselves helpless victims of modified terrain, unable to fight or flee, their expensive vehicles rendered useless by mud. It was an experience that likely contributed to the broader collapse of German military morale in those final days. For the American troops on Hill 227, the engagement provided a different kind of lesson. They witnessed firsthand how someone they might have dismissed, a young black soldier from Louisiana with no formal engineering degree, had accomplished something remarkable through specialized knowledge and creative thinking. Several soldiers from Mitchell's battalion later spoke about how that day changed their perspectives on capability and potential. The trapped German vehicles presented a practical problem that was never fully solved. Most were eventually abandoned in place, left to rust in the basin that had captured them. Some were later salvaged for scrap metal during post-conflict reconstruction, but several remained partially buried for years, silent testimony to the engagement. Local farmers would occasionally encounter remnants while working their fields, a piece of track, a rusted armor plate, physical evidence of that April day in 1945. Modern soil analysis of the Hill 227 basin, conducted in 1998 by researchers from a German university, confirmed Carter's assessment of the terrain's characteristics. The subsurface clay layer averaged 42 inches thick with pre-saturation moisture content of approximately 38 to 42%, exactly the conditions Carter had described. The study concluded that his modifications would indeed have created conditions where vehicles weighing over 3 tons would experience rapid loss of traction and immobilization, validating his methods scientifically decades later. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.